Under a sky the color of deep ink, a lone figure moved across the sleeping city like a shadow that had learned to walk. The thief knew every rooftop, every loose brick, every creaking balcony that might betray him. Lanterns burned low in the narrow streets, casting soft halos over doorways and silent stalls. The wind slipped through the alleys, carrying the smell of dust, cumin, and memories. Tonight, the thief told himself, would be just another job. Quick hands, quiet steps, no unnecessary heroics. He was not a monster and not a saint. Just a man who had learned to survive by staying one step ahead of hunger, guards, and bad luck. He stole from those who had too much to notice and never from those who already counted coins. With trembling fingers, there were lines even a thief would not cross. But lines have a way of blurring in the dark, especially when the city itself feels like it is watching you. Waiting for something to change. At the heart of the city stood the palace. Rising above the roofs like a story people were afraid to finish. Its marble walls caught the moonlight and turned it sharp, like silver blades. The thief had seen it 1,000 times from a distance, but tonight, for the first time, he was close enough to touch its outer wall. His pulse picked up. This was different. This was not some merchant's secret stash or a careless traveler's pouch. This was the king's house. This was where legends were born and people like him usually disappeared. Rumors had swept through the markets all week. The kingdom was crumbling under the weight of unseen troubles. Caravans were vanishing in the desert. Wells were drying out before their time. Traders whispered that the city had been cursed, marked by some ancient power. The old woman who sold dates swore the stars had shifted. The scribe who copied holy verses said the ink had turned to dust under his pen. People needed someone to blame, and they blamed everything at once. The king, fate, foreign enemies, even the wind. The thief did not care much for politics, but he cared about survival. And when a tall, quiet man with eyes like polished obsidian had met him in a shadowy courtyard and slid a small pouch of gold into his hand, he listened. The tall, dark man spoke low and clear, promising more gold than the thief had ever seen if he slipped into the palace and stole one thing. A small, old mirror locked in the king's private chamber. No blood, no bodies. Just that mirror. Easy money, the thief had thought. A little weird, sure, but easy. He ignored the way the man's stare felt like a knife pressed against his soul. Now, balanced on the palace wall, the thief began to understand that nothing about this night would be easy. The guards below moved in tired circles, spears dragging slightly as if the weight of the kingdom hung from their arms. The air felt heavier than usual, like the silence before a storm. He dropped into an inner courtyard, rolled silently, and slipped into the shadows between two columns. Every sense was awake. He could hear his own breathing, steady but tense, the distant hoot of an owl, the whisper of palm leaves brushing stone. Inside the palace, everything smelled of polished wood, rosewater, and secrets. Carpets swallowed his footsteps. Lanterns burned behind golden lattice screens, turning light into patterns that spilled across the floor like trapped stars. He moved with slow precision, counting doorways and turns, following the memory of a rough map he had sketched in his mind from whispers and rumors. The king's private chambers were in the eastern wing, overlooking the gardens and the reflection pools where, they said, the moon came to admire itself. On his way, he passed open doors and glimpsed fragments of a life far away from his own. A room filled with scrolls and sand timers, where a weary scribe slept on his desk with ink on his fingertips. A chamber where the king's armor stood empty, polished and ready, as if the metal remembered battles the man had forgotten. A narrow balcony where a woman stood, awake, staring at the city with eyes that shone in the faint light. The thief saw her hand clutching a thin shawl against the chill, saw the worry in her posture, and kept moving. The palace, he realized, was not just rich. It was tired. At last he reached the door he had been told about. It was not large or ornate, just a heavy wooden door with iron bands and a lock that looked more stubborn than clever. The thief smiled slightly. Locks talked to him. They told him where they were weakest, where metal had grown old or careless. With careful fingers, he coaxed the lock open. It clicked, a small sound that felt loud in the quiet, and the door eased inward. He slipped inside and closed it behind him. feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. The king's private chamber was not what he expected. There was luxury, yes, carved furniture, silken cushions, a wide bed, and walls painted with scenes of rivers and gardens that did not seem to belong to a desert kingdom. But there were also simple things: a worn prayer rug, a wooden staff leaning in a corner, a cracked clay cup on a low table. On another table near the window, surrounded by a ring of half-melted candles, sat the object he had come for. The mirror was small and round, framed in dark metal worn smooth by time. It looked more like something a grandmother would hold than an object worth a king's protection. The thief approached it slowly. Up close, the mirror's surface did not shine like normal glass. It seemed to swallow light, then send it back in a softer, stranger way. The thief caught his own reflection and paused. He saw his face, yes, but it looked slightly different. Not older, not younger, just more honest. The tired lines under his eyes were clearer. The regret he usually buried in jokes and quiet smirks pressed closer to the surface. He frowned and looked away. This was creepy, he thought. But creepy or not, gold was gold. He reached out to grab the mirror. The moment his fingers closed around the frame, the world shifted. The candle's flames leaned toward him, as if dragged by some invisible tide. The room darkened. Though the lanterns burned just as bright, the floor seemed to drop a fraction of an inch, like the whole palace had exhaled. A chill ran down the thief's spine. He froze, hand tight around the mirror, breathing shallow. It felt like someone had just opened a door inside the air, even if it was just his nerves messing with him. Something in his gut whispered that this object was more than a fancy antique. He slipped the mirror into a cloth wrap and tucked it safely inside his vest. He should have left immediately. Instead, he turned toward the window for just a second. Below, the palace gardens stretched out like a dream, pools of water catching. The moonlight, palm shadows bending over quiet stone paths. The city beyond lay in darkness, its roofs and towers softened by night. Somewhere out there, the tall dark man was waiting. The thief had promised himself he would never think too hard about the people who paid him. But tonight, he felt it. A thin line between what he wanted and what felt wrong. On his way back through the corridors, the palace felt different. The silence grew thicker, like the air was listening. The thief moved faster, his steps still soft but more urgent. As he turned a corner, he nearly collided with a figure. There, standing in the middle of the hallway, was the king, not on a throne, not surrounded by guards, just a man in a simple robe, barefoot, holding a lantern. The thief froze, every instinct screaming at him to run, but his body would not move. The king's face looked older up close, not like the perfect images on coins. There was sorrow in his eyes and something heavier, like the weight of 1,000 decisions that never sat quite right. The thief expected shouting, alarms, a sword, but none came. The king looked at him, at the bulge in his vest where the mirror rested, and then beyond him, as if seeing straight through to the desert and the storms gathering there. The thief felt his heart slam against his ribs. In that strange, thick silence, something passed between them. Not words, not threats, just two men standing at the intersection of fate, both tired in different ways. The thief realized, with a sudden dry panic, that he was looking at someone who was more trapped than he was. The king's hand tightened, slightly on the lantern handle, and for a moment, the flame flickered. The thief, pulse racing, shifted his weight, ready to bolt. But the king just stepped aside very slowly, leaving a space wide enough for one frightened man to walk through. The thief did. He moved past, feeling the king's gaze like heat on his back. No guards came. No alarm was raised. If guilt had a sound, it would have been the echo of his own footsteps as he slipped away. He did not know whether to thank the man or hate him for that silence. In the courtyard, the air felt cooler, but not calmer. The thief crossed the shadows and climbed the outer wall with shaking hands. When he dropped back into the sleeping city, the streets felt different too, like they were holding their breath. He kept to the narrow alleys, avoiding the main roads, until he reached the place where he was supposed to meet the tall dark man. It was an empty square, with a dry fountain in the center and an old fig tree leaning over it. Branches twisted like fingers pointing at the sky. The thief waited there, feeling the mirror's weight like a hot stone against his chest. The tall, dark man stepped out from behind the fig tree like he had been poured from the shadows. His smile was smooth, carefully shaped, but his eyes stayed cold. He asked no questions and offered no praise. His gaze dropped to the thief's vest, to the mirror hidden inside. The thief's instinct screamed again. Something in the way the man reached out his hand felt wrong. Too eager, too hungry. The thief had seen that look before. In gamblers who had lost everything and believed one more throw of the dice could fix their lives. For a heartbeat, he almost handed it over. He thought of the gold, thought of the freedom it would buy. A small house at the edge of the city, maybe a quiet corner where no one knew his face or his past. He thought of never having to slip through shadows again. But beneath those dreams, another image rose, the king's tired eyes, the silent hallways, the city's wells drying up, the caravans disappearing like sand in the wind. He suddenly knew, as clearly as if someone had whispered it in his ear, that this mirror was tied to all of it. Handing it over would not just change his life, it would break something in the kingdom that could never be fixed. So he did something he rarely did. He trusted his conscience more than his fear. He took a step back instead of forward. The tall, dark man's face tightened just a little, the way a mask creaks before it cracks. The thief said nothing, but the decision hung in the air between them like a drawn blade. The tall, dark man's hand curled at his side. He did not beg. He did not threaten. He just watched the thief with a look that promised trouble that would last beyond this night. Then, slowly, he faded back into the shadows and was gone, leaving the square colder than before. Now the thief stood alone with a stolen artifact, a half-broken conscience, and a kingdom that, apparently, was tangled up in both. He could not return the mirror like nothing had happened. He could not keep it for himself either. He had opened a door he did not understand, and now there was no safe way to close it. He wrapped his cloak tighter around him and headed not toward his usual hiding places, but toward the edge of the city, where the sand began and the world felt bigger and more honest. At the edge of the desert, the night opened up, vast and unforgiving. The dunes glowed faintly under the moon. The wind moved over them, erasing tracks the moment they were made, like time erasing names from memory. The thief walked until the city became a jagged shadow behind him. Finally, he sat on a dune and took out the mirror. The glass seemed darker now, as if it knew it had been stolen. The thief gazed into it, letting the wind swirl around him, and saw more than his face. He saw flashes of the city, wells cracking, crops wilting, children staring at the sky with empty eyes. Then he saw something stranger, the king alone in his chamber, standing by the window, staring out at the same desert. The mirror showed him pacing, kneeling on the old prayer rug, pressing his hands against his face as if trying to hold his thoughts in place. It showed the tall, dark man, too, standing in another city entirely, surrounded by people with eyes like broken promises. The thief watched as the man traced marks on a map, circles around the kingdom, lines like chains tightening. The mirror did not just reflect faces, it reflected choices and consequences, branching out like veins of water in dry sand. The thief felt fear, yes, but also something else, responsibility. It was not a feeling he was used to. He had always lived like his actions were small, contained, hurting no one who mattered. But this mirror turned that lie inside out. Every action was a stone dropped into water, and the ripples reached farther than he wanted to admit. If he handed the mirror over to the wrong hands, the kingdom would drown in those ripples. If he kept it hidden, the curse strangling the city would tighten. Either way, he was in the story now, and there was no getting out of it. As the first hint of dawn brushed the horizon with pale light, the thief made another decision. He turned back toward the city. The walk felt longer this time, like the sand itself was testing him, asking if he really meant it. By the time he reached the gates, the sky was turning pink and gold. People were beginning to stir. Bakers lit their ovens, smoke curling up like quiet prayers. The old man with the cane swept dust from in front of his door, as if trying to brush away his worries. No one knew that a thief was walking back into the palace not to take, but to return something that could change everything. He slipped through the waking streets and scaled the palace wall with muscles that ached now, not from exertion, but from the weight of his choice. Inside, the guards looked more worn than ever, eyes shadowed, movements sluggish. The air felt tight, like a drum stretched afar. The thief moved quickly and quietly toward the king's chambers. He did not know how this would end. Maybe in chains, maybe worse. But there are moments when survival and dignity part ways, and he had chosen which one to follow. When he reached the chamber door, it was already open. The king stood by the window where the thief had seen him in the mirror's vision. He turned slowly, and this time, there was no shock in his eyes, only a deep, tired understanding. The thief took out the mirror and placed it gently on the table with the candles. The flames bent toward it again, as if recognizing an old master. The king's gaze softened, and for a moment, the thief saw not a ruler and a criminal, but two men who had both failed people in different ways and were trying, clumsily, to fix it. Together, they faced the mirror. It showed them the kingdom as it was, broken and small, quiet ways that added up to a storm. It showed corrupt officials taking from the poor, harsh laws crushing gentle hearts, and enemies circling like vultures over a wounded animal. But it also showed something else. It showed people helping one another in small, stubborn acts of kindness. A woman sharing bread she could barely spare. A scribe secretly teaching a boy to read. A guard turning a blind eye to a hungry child stealing a single fig. The kingdom was not just doomed. It was still alive, still capable of changing its reflection. The king realized, with a sharp ache in his chest, that the mirror was not cursed. It was honest, too honest. Long ago, when he had first looked into it, he had seen his own fear and pride and turned away. Instead of facing what it showed, he had locked it away, trying to hide the truth even from himself. The kingdom had followed his example, burying problems instead of healing them. The thief, of all people, had dragged that truth back into the light. The king felt both ashamed and strangely grateful. The thief realized something too. He had always thought of himself as outside the story of the kingdom, a shadow slipping along the edges. But the mirror had shown him that nobody is outside the story. Every small act, good or bad, joins the same river. He had helped the wrong people, ignored the cries he could have answered, convinced himself that as long as he stole with a little mercy, he was not part of the damage. Seeing the mirror's visions, he understood that neutrality is just a quieter form of choosing. In the days that followed, things did not magically fix themselves. This was not that kind of tale. But the king began to change the way he ruled. He listened more, punished less, and sent trusted messengers into the streets not to spy, but to listen. The mirror stayed in his chamber, uncovered. Every week, he stood before it to face what he did not want to see. The thief did not become a nobleman or a hero carved into marble. He remained what he was, but different on the inside. He used his skills to uncover hidden corruption.